My name is Felicia Cook, and this is my Think Aloud on the first chapter of the book Stone Fox, written by John Reynolds Gardner. When I first look at this title page, I look at the font of the title and how it's written in big, bold writing so that it makes me think this text is for a lower grade level and it will be a simplistic read. When I look at the illustration, I immediately question what it is the dog is holding, and I make generalizations about the setting and what era this book was set to be in. I look at the illustrations and I think about how they were simplistic, they were not in color, they were limited in details, and it shed light on the setting, which allowed me to make connections. I looked at the little boy and how he didn't have on a shirt under his coveralls, and this is something typically seen in the past or in the olden days of a farm worker. On the first page of the chapter, it's titled Grandfather, and here I began thinking ahead of reasons why Grandfather wouldn't get up. I started thinking about, was he sick? Was he dying? What could be the reasons? I then looked in a little bit further. I began to make inferences regarding the farmer's health relating to the hard work that it is on the field. I also questioned why little Willie lived on the farm with his grandfather and not with his parents. So these are all of my initial thoughts as I began to read this chapter. On this page, I began making connections or was drawing connections relating to the text to determine little Willie's age as it relates to the dog. On page 5, it reads, she was an old dog, actually born on the same day as little Willie, which was over 10 years ago, period. This lets us know that little Willie is approximately 10 years old. I also began visualizing what Searchlight looked like, as the descriptive language indicates she's a big black dog with a white spot on her forehead the size of a silver dollar. This visualization gave me a very clear picture of what Searchlight looked like and allowed me to draw on my own illustrations. I began to think about the syntax and the setting and how fluent they were with the time period that the book was set in. The vocabulary and the text used words that connected with the setting. For example, on page 4, he says, hurry up or you'll be eaten with the chickens. And then it goes on to read that little Willie found his plate out by the chicken coop. Again, even though the descriptive language is written simplistic, it allows the reader to get a very good descriptive visualization of what each character looks like. As in on page 5, it reads, Doc Smith had snow white hair and wore a long black dress. Her skin was tan and her face was covered with wrinkles. This clearly lets you know that this is an older woman who has gray hair and she's wearing a long conservative black dress. On page 6, I was inferring or making inferences when Doc Smith got up after realizing that Grandfather was not playing. As she initially did not think anything about little Willie's concerns until she heard that Grandfather went to bed without playing his harmonica, period. On page 7, I had to do some word solving with the word palomino, as it was used to describe Doc Smith's horse. I believe that, and I thought that children would not know much about horse breeds, and if I were to read this book aloud to them, that would be a question that I would have to answer. So I used some of the context clues around it to infer that Doc Smith's horse was a beautiful horse, as it indicates he was a handsome palomino. I also like how the syntax continues throughout when making reference to the setting, as it states, Little Willie hitched Rex to the wagon, making a continuous fluency throughout the chapter of the setting and the time period that this book was set in. I began making connections as the author mentioned several times about Searchlight's closeness with grandfathers, as it states, Searchlight put her big front paws on the bed and rested her head on grandfather's chest. She licked his beard, which was full of tears. The illustration on this page made me think about the urgency in that Little Willie and Searchlight was in, as it shows them running through the forest, running down the road, trying to get to Doc Smith, and she doesn't immediately sense any urgency as she continues to read her book. On page 8 and 9 of this chapter, I critiqued what some of the language was and how it never made mention to what the long silver object was that Doc Smith pulled from her bag. I liked how simplistic the conversation was between Doc Smith and Little Willie, and this made the fluency connect throughout the chapter because it was simple phrased, and it made me get a feel of how each character was feeling, and how they communicated with each other was in tune with the time setting. Some of the visualizations I made on this page was making the connection to the previous text about grandfather staring to the ceiling, as it was mentioned on the beginning of the chapter, but making this connection and actual seeing the illustration painted a very clear picture of what you already had in your mind. I also analyzed the text as I was thinking about where was the author going with the questions that was being asked by Doc Smith on the bottom of page 9 regarding grandfather's condition. On page 10, I began to remember information that was previously stated in the beginning of the chapter, as it made several references to tears rolling down grandfather's cheeks and disappearing into his beard. It made me think that this was an important visualization, an image that the author wanted the reader to grasp, as it was mentioned 3 times in this short chapter alone. I also synthesized as I thought forward about how was Little Willie going to get his grandfather up? How was he going to get life into him again? What were the things that he could potentially do as a young child? I was analyzing page 10 at the bottom when it discusses Little Willie was silent for a long time before he spoke. And then he questioned, but what about fishing? And the rodeo, the turkey dinners? Doesn't he want to do those things anymore? I began to get emotional, and I believe this was the exact feelings that the author wanted to get out from the reader. And he wanted to grasp the closeness of the relationship that Little Willie had with his grandfather. I also was analyzing and thinking about the vocabulary of this text and thinking in the statement, medically, he's healthy as an ox. I immediately began to think as I read this story to young readers, would they be able to make the connection of what healthy as an ox meant? So those were some of my thoughts as I read this chapter. It was a very interesting chapter, and it did make me want to continue reading the rest of this book, as I did eventually do.